Welcome to the Flashback podcast, where we flash back into the most horrible times of history. In this episode, we will be flashbacking to 1st September 1939. Some of you may know what happened in 1939, but for those of you sitting at home confused, in 1939, a truly horrible thing happened. Mothers were unable to see their children for years. Their homes were destroyed and thousands of people were killed. Today, we will be talking about the Blitz and Project Pied Piper. As aforementioned, people died and mothers weren't able to see their children for years. But how did this come to be? Hitler. That's the answer. But there's a lot more to it. The Blitz was a name given to the German bombing on Britain. Usually this bombing was done on a nightly basis, as the months passed by, the bombing started to happen in broad daylight as well. London is the biggest city in England, and was the city most affected by far, but it was certainly not the only city bombed. Most heavily populated cities were affected greatly by the bombings. London, Manchester, Liverpool, Sheffield, Manchester, Coventry, Southampton, and many more cities were horribly bombed and had to be rebuilt. The rebuilding of the cities wasn't easy either, and took years before they were the same again. The Blitz cost Britain greatly, not only in money but in lives as well. The Blitz destroyed hundreds of homes and buildings that were never built again. People who worked their entire lives just to buy a home had their houses destroyed. Nothing was spared. The Blitz cost around $1 billion every single night. That's right, not in total, but every single night. That's unimaginable. Imagine losing $1 billion a single day. You'd go broke instantly. There was not much England could do. The situation was dire. The bombings were regular and there was no stopping to them. The planes would fly over the city, bomb it, and retreat. The British Air Force shot down over 1,700 planes and lost 1,250 aircrafts as well. Even though Britain's air forces suffered less, they could still not shoot down all of the planes. The planes that escaped caused mass destruction. An idea may have come to your head by now. Why don't they just make a bomb shelter? There were many types of shelter in the World War. Like the Anderson shelter, a shelter that could be placed under your yard. Yet, shelters were not foolproof, and not everyone could afford them or had the space for them. Evacuation was really the only option. But where? Much of the surrounding countries in Europe were already conquered by Germany, and the ones remaining were already at war with Germany as well. The only place left was Britain itself. They couldn't cross the ocean. A solution comes to mind. The German planes mainly flew over the heavily populated areas of Britain, such as London or Manchester. The people could evacuate to the rural areas. With this solution, another problem arose. There would be no homes for people, and by the time the houses would be built, there would be many casualties. The people Britain needed most for the future were the children. If the children wouldn't survive, then Britain itself wouldn't have a future. The decision that was made was undoubtedly a tough one. The children had to leave their homes and get on to trains to unknown places far away from the city. It is estimated that over 800,000 kids were evacuated. When the children reached their destination, they would be chosen by foster families like it was a school sports game. This left the children traumatized. Imagine being picked last because you're fat and no one wants you. As expected, many parents were reluctant to let their sweet little children go to some strangers that they didn't even know or had contact with. However, most parents would rather have their children be alive than with them and in extreme danger. But some straight up refused to let their children go. It was a choice after all. The total number of children that died in the war was just shy of 8,000, and the total number of children seriously injured was 7,600. If not for the 800,000 children that evacuated and many other women and men, the death total would have been much, much higher. When the bombings were well underway and were frequent, they suddenly stopped for no apparent reason. This was because Hitler was not ready for a full-scale attack on Britain and France, the two countries he was at war with at the time. During this time, when Hitler was preparing, the attacks practically stopped, leading many people to believe it was safe to go back home. Almost half the children were back to their parents' home before Christmas. All these children came back home despite the warnings from the government. When Hitler finally defeated France, England was next. The bombings redoubled in frequency. The children came back home just to evacuate again, and this time the evacuations didn't end until a year later. Imagine that. It's like COVID. We think it's gone and it comes straight back. The air raids seemed like they would never stop and kept getting worse and worse until 1944. There was no choice but to make another mass evacuation. The war would, after all, one day end. Many years later, finally come to an end. Many lives were sacrificed and many soldiers fought tirelessly. When the only thing left was the aftermath of the war, the children were allowed to see their parents again after years on end. It was the one thing every child had been waiting for, a happy reunion. However, as most things in life, it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows. Many kids found out that their homes had been destroyed and there was nothing left but rubble and debris. Some even found out that even their parents weren't there. That's right. After waiting for many years and finally coming back, some children found out that their parents didn't live in the same place and had to find them. Well, that's the best case scenario. The worst possibility was that the parents just didn't want their children anymore or had died. Most parents had become accustomed to living alone without having to take care of their children, and of course many of them did want their children to come back more than anything. It was a different story for others. The children that came back had completely different personalities. They had, after all, lived in a farm or a rural area without many luxuries for years. They liked different things and were of course much older. The parents had missed a very big chunk of their children's childhood. All in all, the ending of the Blitz was neither good nor bad. Many people died over the course of the war, and even more were injured. Britain suffered a great loss and had to rebuild for years. Yet Britain would have suffered more if not for the mass evacuations and the children were safe and sound when they came back. The plan England made worked out perfectly.